assure allies through forward presence and engagement. If deterrence fails, we are expected to defeat one adversary in a large-scale, multi-phase campaign, while denying near simultaneously the objectives of or imposing unacceptable costs on another aggressor in a different region. Secretary Carter and General Milley have offered increasing specificity here recently. The SecDef recently identified 5 evolving threats: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and the condition of counterterrorism, and specifically prioritized Russia and China as the most stressing competitors. This suggests that we may have to return to a pacing threat construct. Similarly, the chief has noted that the U.S. Army does not have the luxury of preparing to fight only one type of enemy at one time and in one place. We have to fight guerrillas and terrorists all the way up through nation-state armies. This is a challenge because there are many in the think tank community in Washington who wish us to optimize for one fight or another. We don't have that luxury, but gaining the right set or balance of capabilities and capacity is a challenge in a resource-constrained environment. Therefore, increasing instability, the rise of great power competition, and a more lethal operational environment, coupled with the potential for or requirement for us to conduct operations simultaneously, puts great demand on a smaller Army. Operational demand in support of our current combat commands is much higher across the force than on the eve of 9/11. Our bog-dwell period for some units is as bad as it was in the last decade's surge into Iraq and Afghanistan, with Armor Brigade combat teams, aviation brigades, division headquarters, and military intelligence battalions at less than 1-to-1 in a ratio of time away with time at home. That does not diminish how important their mission is when they are away. Contingency demand, as I noted earlier, is growing significantly as instability and existential threats accumulate. And as the Chief has noted, today both our capacity and capability could be seriously challenged in the future. Capability or capacity, as you often hear the arguments where I live in Washington, is a false choice. We must have adequate amounts of both to deter, defend the homeland, defeat and deny and support current and future readiness. We know we have capability gaps, particularly against our near-peer competitors. General McMaster noted penetrating an anti-access area denial envelope, dealing with the renewed threat of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, countering unmanned aerial systems, indirect fires, range, volume, and munition types are all challenges for us. Air and missile defense, cyber and electronic warfare, the armor, anti-armor competition, and speed, particularly given the fact that our adversaries all have interior lines in the areas we are most likely to have to meet on a future battlefield. Non-material solutions for these gaps are as large and as important as the material solution space that we'll talk about in some of the other presentations. We cannot expand or regenerate forces fast enough to meet the immediate demands of likely conflicts today or in the future. We know we have capacity challenges right now. We are stretched and becoming more so when it comes to meeting the demands of the defense strategy. Technology is unlikely to offset this problem in the short or medium term. Capacity is also a direct contributor to one of our key asymmetric advantages, our ability to build and maintain alliances. There is an article, which I think is emblematic of this, entitled, "Why China Has No Friends." But the small cost of building these alliances and partnerships is minuscule compared to the very real and high cost of not being engaged around the world, and that is war. The Army is investing carefully in both capability and capacity. In capability, we are protecting our RDT&E spending, and we are participating in the third offset strategy inside the Pentagon and have led a long-range research and development planning program effort focused solely on ground combat. We are continuing to conduct selective modernization in key capability areas, including aviation, the network, and combat vehicles. Technology with potential application for the future includes robotics, air and ground protection, lethality, and frankly, medical capabilities. But our non-material efforts are just as critical. Professional military education, leader development, concepts, doctrine, experimentation, and most importantly, given the Chief's emphasis on readiness, training. Regarding capacity, our current glide path to 980,000 by 2018 was shaped before many of the issues I've raised in the strategic environment were clear. Russia, ISIL, Iraq, Syria, extension of the Afghan campaign all became facts of life after that decision was made. To address this challenge, we are making the most efficient use of the structure and strength we have, carefully managing combat units, streamlining headquarters, and increasing the operational use of our National Guard and our Army Reserve. But stress on the force is real. Thank you.
Conrad, why don't you go next?
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about the historical relationship in capacity and technology, to make some observations. Sometimes the technology comes first and employment ideas come second. Examples: methodical battle in World War I, the idea of blitzkrieg in World War II, where they took existing technologies and created operating concepts around them. That doesn't always work. Back in my previous life, I was the executive officer for the Sergeant York Battalion. Sergeant York was the greatest air defense gun of its day, very deadly, out to about 4 kilometers, but it was only very late in the process that somebody asked the question, what battlefield operating concept do we fit in? And they said, well, your main threat is a Soviet helicopter with a standoff range of 8 kilometers. You kind of figure out that the numbers there don't work real well. The only time we tried to move one at the end of my tour, we were trying to get one to the Air Defense Museum, and it caught fire and burned to the ground. So there are some other flaws, too. Ideally, though, ideas should drive technology. The ideas should come first. A good example would be the development of precision bombing in the U.S. Air Force. In 1945, Hap Arnold, back in the days when he was still a soldier, wrote his final report to Secretary of War on World War II and said, I quote, "National safety would be endangered by an Air Force whose doctrines and techniques are tied solely to the equipment and processes of the moment. The Air Force must keep its doctrines ahead of its equipment and its vision far into the future." Now, a caution for that. T.X. Hammis has a famous quote, there's a very fine line between a vision and an hallucination. So you've got to be careful on you want a realistic vision. But the idea, though, is you want the ideas to drive the technology ideally. Good example for the Army is TRADOC thinking and doctrine drive the development of the Big Five for the Army in the 1970s and the 1980s. And historically, the best ideas appeared during times of constrained budgets. There's a famous Winston Churchill quote from their war years to the cabinet, "Gentlemen, we have run out of money, we have to think now." And there's a lot of truth in that. These ideas that appear during periods of constrained budgets set the stage for expansion when money becomes available. Now, during times of constrained budgets, the Army has also been pretty good at finding cheap game changers. And a good example is the interwar years, they fund the M1 Garand rifle, the best infantry weapon of its day. Now, as we got a little bit from General Hicks and also from General McMaster, the American military uses technology more and better than anyone else. And it's often seen as our biggest asymmetric advantage in modern warfare. But our enemies learn and adapt. There are always counters for technology. Overdependence can become a vulnerability. For instance, are we really prepared to fight unplugged if someone takes down the internet or takes down our SATCOMs. Also, we were not prepared to deal with the intricacies of Dow Tron by the North Vietnamese in Vietnam, despite an overwhelming technological advantage on that particular battlefield. In every major conflict, this gets to the point about surprise that HR hinted at. By the way, HR is the only three-star general in the Army who survived 2 OERs from me, so that shows you how talented he is. In every major war, we've been victims of technological surprise. Japanese torpedoes in their Zero, German U-boats and V-2s and 88s, Soviet MiG-15s in Korea, sophisticated North Vietnamese air defenses, Saggers, SA-6s, SA-7s in 1973 war, IEDs in the current conflict. We must be resilient enough to recover from such surprise and develop our own counters, which are sometimes technological, sometimes intellectual. And of course, we rarely, if ever, get the kind of war we expect, where we expect, when we expect. So, if there's anything I would change in General Milley's discussion of how the Army needs prepared, I think the biggest area where the Army and its supporting agencies like yourselves need to be prepared is we've got to be intellectually prepared. Our biggest asymmetric advantage needs to be intellectual. We've got to be able to learn, adapt, and anticipate better and faster than all our potential adversaries. Thank you.
Thanks, Conrad. Next, we'll hear from Nadia Shadlow.
As everyone in the audience knows, a fundamental issue consistently debated in the defense and national security community is how do we design military forces to achieve desired strategic and political outcomes within resource constraints and trade-offs. This in turn raises the issue of capacity. The discussions are not new, but arguably they are especially vociferous today because of the challenges of the disordered world combined with budget caps and the explosion of potentially revolutionary technologies, which puts pressure on policymakers to consider ways to conduct war in less costly or perhaps radically new and different ways. The urge to reduce the size of the military following a major conflict, coupled with the need to control government spending, has many questioning the requirement for land forces capacity, and some would say land forces in general. As pressure mounts to further reduce the size of the Army, an increasing range of enemies, adversaries, and threats continue to challenge the United States. The issue of capacity, I think, is interesting because it sort of captures many of the strategic dilemmas that we're talking about today on a broader level. The problem of deterrence. How large a force do we need to deter our adversaries? This is linked to capacity. The problem of surging, because the location, scale, and duration of future conflicts are difficult to predict. What is the capacity required to surge when needed? Many would argue that the effort to grow the Army by about 100,000 soldiers to support OEF and OIF was extraordinarily difficult and costly. Third, capacity also relates to the range of missions that the Army needs to be prepared for. You can only ask it to do so much and to be skilled in so many requirements for specific missions. Again, the relationship between capacity and mission sets is important. Fourth, capacity is linked to the challenge of rapidly regenerating ground forces. If we can't rapidly regenerate due to the sophistication of modern weaponry and communication systems, in addition to the complexity of missions, this also has implications for capacity. And fifth, as General Hicks pointed out earlier, it involves the nature of our relationships with our allies and overall our presence abroad in the building partnership capacity and the different terms used to express that mission set. But the sixth area, actually, that I'd like to raise this morning is the question of control of territory. This really is at the heart of some of the discussions we're having today about capacity. How do discussions about capacity revolve around this fundamental requirement in war? In discussions about the changing character of war, as General Milley and others have frequently pointed out, many argue that the character of war will change, technologies will change that, but not the nature of war. And in thinking about that, what does that say about the problem of control of territory? Is it a problem that we're likely to continue to have? Will changes in the character of war obviate this necessity? I don't think it will. Why? Success in war requires, as we've talked about, the consolidation of gains. State or non-state actors seek territorial control, from ISIS to Russian-backed insurgents in Ukraine. So the relationship between capacity and control of territory is the central one. Army operational concepts such as wide area security address this problem of control at the operational level. And there is emerging work related to the joint concept for integrated campaign planning, in which Army contributions are key. That work also revolves around the idea that operational military gains are meaningless if they do not, in concert with other instruments of power, achieve the strategic policy objectives of the campaign. There are two problem sets I'd like to pose to you this morning related to the issue of capacity and control of territory. First, to what degree can technology address this problem? And that's sort of an open question for many of you in the audience that are working on that issue. But the second involves political and strategic considerations. On the first point, clearly technology matters. The challengers are there: Russian long-range fires capabilities, electronic and cyber warfare capabilities. They challenge the U.S. ability to acquire and control territory. And there are technological solution sets that you all are working on. But the second problem set, I think, is probably the more problematic one: the strategic and political problems that relate to control over territory. Because at the strategic level, there's fundamental ambivalence, I would argue, about this requirement, or at least for how long we need to be there. There's considerable ambivalence regarding how long the Army needs to stay, for how long, and to do what. There's a sense that, as we've talked about, the other panelists have talked about, myths that technology can do it all, the idea that everything can be done by special forces, the idea that we can avoid wars that involve stabilization. Historically, the Army has never been able to avoid such wars. Fourth, there's a sense that an ambivalence that we can avoid dealing with the messy politics on the ground. Army soldiers have always had to deal with politics on the ground, which again is a part of consolidation and a part of control of territory. There's a concern as well that civilians have, many political leaders, about the military getting involved in these messy political situations on the ground. So I would argue that fundamentally this problem of strategic ambivalence related to the consolidation of gains is at the fundamental root of many of the problems regarding capacity that we're talking about this morning. Thank you.
General Wharton.
Thanks, sir. Well, good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here. What I want to do is talk in terms of really three different areas. I'll talk to you a little about technology. I want to talk to you about innovation, and then I want to talk to industry and thank industry for the great work that you're doing for us, and to tell you that we can't do it without you. So I want to talk to you a little about that. But let me tell you a little bit about my command so you really understand what we do. And that's one of the things I really want to do, is try to get the word out. I have the mission to ensure decisive overmatch for the Army, Joint Forces, and the nation. And when it was first given to me, it was given to me for up to 2040 and beyond. I kind of cut the 2040 off, but we're still looking way out there. So when we look at decisive overmatch from a technological standpoint, we're looking at current to midterm, then to the deep futures and in the out years. And when you think about it, it's like a Rubik's Cube, right? I mean, how do you got nation state, non-nation state, you have near-peer competitors, you have multiple domains that you have to operate in. So how do you design and how do you operate in that kind of environment? So the command that I have is, I'm Mission Command to General Vi at AMC. We have a strong dotted line back to ASALT and the authorities at AAE that gives us the money and the S&T to do what we need. And then also we get requirements from TRADOC. So we try to synchronize all those, balance the warfighting challenges, line our S&T task up to the warfighting challenges, and the capability needs assessment. So I have about 74% of the Army's S&T budget. We're part of the Army enterprise. We're not the whole S&T enterprise. but I have about 11,000 scientists and engineers. For industry, we have about 1,000 cooperative research and development agreements with industry. For academia, we have about 1,500 different arrangements where we're information sharing. And why? Because if I took basic research, 60% of all the funding we get in basic research is to industry and academia, primarily academia. If I go to prototyping, you know, in the 6 funds, for those of you who know that money, about 90% goes to industry. So you see us trying to, as an Army, try to get more money and return on prototyping so we can give the chief options to design, to innovate, to repurpose existing equipment so that we can use it in the future. We have over 500 research agreements with DoD laboratories. We're in about 28 countries with international technology exchanges and information agreements. But let me talk about that, and I ask people not to forget the E in engineering, that we have the Army's, about 50% of the Army's engineers that do that repurpose, that re-innovate. See, so if we can avoid a major ACAT-1 program by repurposing, by innovating, taking existing systems and use them in a different way, then we can save a lot and we don't have to go through the acquisition process. You heard General McMaster talk about technologies. Let me talk to you about, there's really 3. Bridging technologies, marginal improvements, don't affect doctrine, leap ahead technologies, get us to a next level of combat effectiveness. And then when you talk about disruptive technologies, those are technologies that change doctrine. So if we took a historical example, the use of the helicopter, you know, we introduced that in the battlefield. Then another disruptive technology is air mobile operations in Vietnam. So as we look to the future and we look at disruptive technologies, I'll give you another aviation. We designed degraded visual environment so we could land aircraft in the desert, and we wouldn't land one aircraft on top of the other and save our pilots' lives. Well, that application to be able to see through dust in any clouded environment, what happens if we can see through any obscurant and we put it on the ground, and now you can see through any environment, and that has a ground application for ground combat systems and even the individual soldier. So where is the match, overmatch, least available? And it's not at the strategic, it's not at the operational level, it's down at the tactical level where the soldier's kicking in the door. So one of the technologies that we give him decisive overmatch. So if we can take and optimize his ability to give him advantage when he's kicking in the door, heads-up display, you know, he can see through any obscurant. We used to say another disruptive technology was owning the night. Now that technology is available in commercial sources. So what I tell our folks is we want to own the environment. I want to be able to see through any obscurant. I want to have a decisive overmatch advantage, so when you're kicking in the door, our soldiers can see and then can engage. So at the lowest level is where it really is most even. Let me just a couple of one-liners. There's no silver bullets in technology. It's how we use technology in a dot mil PF construct. It's how we use it into an operating concept, and how we design that technology from there. So some of the things that we're doing in innovation, let me just talk about innovation. I see Dr. Russell here, Open Campus, Delphi, Maryland. He's got about 200 people. It's industry, academia. You're more than welcome to participate and share our labs with DoD, with industry and academia at the Delphi, Maryland. We're going to open up another site, ARL West, so we attract West Coast scientists. Now, if we can connect all the dots, all the research development engineering centers, with all the academia points that we have agreements with our overseas presence, we form this S&T, global S&T ecosystem where we're information sharing and getting the best from all the environment. So that's kind of our goal, is this global S&T ecosystem that allows us to get the best of industry, the best of academia, share it, and open campus kind of environment. We're also using technology as a benevolent form of theater security cooperation, and in terms of this panel, of building partner capacity. So if I enter an information exchange agreement overseas with a country, you know, we're helping a combatant commander on building partner capacity. So that's how we're using a soft power a soft form of power with, you're not putting boots on the ground, you got scientists, you got engineers sharing notes at universities and things of that nature. Now let me talk a little bit about the importance of industry. I talked to what you do. We could not do it without industry and academia. You know, you heard some of the areas that we're looking at in the future. You know, anywhere from, you know, protecting the network, you know, autonomy, artificial intelligence, technology, wargaming, prototyping, assured position navigation timing. Those are some of the areas that we're looking at investing in and that we're moving forward. So I'll leave you with one more thought, is that I told you 90% is in industry for the prototyping. I don't know if that's the right balance. What's the right balance? We'll work through that. But let me give you a thought. So what does the future battlefield look like? And this is just, you know, bantering around with our scientists and all the experts in there. But what's the convergent point, right? Where does technology converge in the 2040 fight? And you know, so what happens when you get the best of nanotechnology, the best of biotechnology, the best of big data on the battlefield? You get a military intranet or Internet of Things, a battlefield intranet where everything's connected, you know, hardware, software convergence, and then how do you optimize that? So that's way out in the 2040 of of what that convergent point is, right, out here. And then as we have midterm and short term, we have to respond in the near term to any threats. A lot of those threats you hear come, you know, I'll use the example, our Edgewood Chemical Biological Center responds to a lot of those threats around the world. So do our other research development engineering centers that are all represented here today. So let me just stop there so that we can take some of the questions. I saw a lot of questions before I spoke, so hopefully they're for everyone else. Thank you.
All right, first question is for General McMaster. It comes to us from a retired four-star whose initials start with JD. Can you tell me what the Army is doing to increase armor capacity?
All right, so I'll tell you, one of the key things we think is short in the Army. We think we have about 8 big problems in the Army right now. And I mentioned one of them already. The Army, we think, is getting too small, right? So that means we have to get the most out of the force we have, and Bill talked about especially what we're doing across the total force. We think our Army's become too light. You know, we began to sort of optimize, you know, for Afghanistan in particular. And I think some people made some strange assumptions about the nature of future war that really have not panned out, right? That you just really need to be lean and nimble. But as I've said previously, you know, Richard Simmons, who's just, you know, reemerged, he's lean and nimble, right? But you don't send Richard Simmons to go fight anybody, right? So you need a force that has, you know, that really can get there fast, but can also have the mobility, protection, and lethality necessary to accomplish the mission, to overmatch the enemy and accomplish the mission. We're concerned that the Army might be out of position. And if you look at Russia, obviously, you know, waging limited war for limited objectives and so forth. So there are about 8 problems. These are some of them. And so on the armored force capacity in particular, we're looking at all sorts of options to be able to grow capacity in terms of numbers of armored brigade combat teams across the total force. But it's in particular, you know, in the active component where we've got, you know, units only, you know, deploying for a year, coming back for a year, deploying for a year, coming back for a year. And then also we're looking at capacity within armored brigade combat teams. Because if you have fewer armored brigade combat teams, those brigades better have the depth in their capability to sustain combat operations over time, right? To seize, retain, and also exploit the initiative. I am in particular concerned about our mechanized infantry strength. Our mechanized infantry strength in 1997, for example, 46% of the Army's infantry were mechanized, and we're going down to 13%. Okay, so when you look at obviously the wake-up call in Ukraine, we need armored forces in sufficient capacity. That's numbers of brigades. What are we doing? It's probably premature to go into specifics, but I think we have some good options for the chief. We're working obviously as an extension of the Army staff, which what ARCIC and TRADOC is, an extension of the Army staff to develop options. We're also designing some future force capabilities out to 2030 But the idea is by December, we will have designed, the Army of 2030 as a benchmark to say, what can we do today to begin to evolve toward that force in the future? But I know it's not a non-answer to you, sir, but we have some good options, and I think the National Commission for the Future of the Army made recommendations that we've been able to use to generate some more momentum as well.
You want me to answer something?
Next question is for General Hicks. If we are trying to build capacity, why are we relying on rotational forces for Europe and Korea instead of forward stationing? Rotational forces takes 3 to 1 for Bogdwell, with forward stationing would not only free up units preparing and resetting, but would also assure our allies and deter aggressors. Please explain.
Rotational forces are a recognition of our increasingly U.S.-based Army and the fact that our demands overseas have not gone away. So, on the one hand, many of the arguments laid out in the question have merit. On the other hand, there is also value in this rotational approach. So it is harder on our troops, as I noted in my remarks, and the personnel tempo is an issue. But we have to balance political reality of where the Army's based versus the strategic reality of where we have to deter and defend overseas. And that's part one. Part two, we have been deploying an Army for the last arguably 10, maybe even 15 years on a fairly predictable schedule. And other than the first units to deploy for OIF, most of them have not had to go through the normal process of preparing to deploy and then deploying and then receiving and moving their equipment into an operation, which used to be a routine task that every unit in the Army was used to, from at the port to the receiving ports in a foreign country, etc. So this rotational presence that we're undergoing actually gives us an opportunity to regain what is an atrophied skill, and in some units, quite frankly, is non-resident. There are many units that don't have any familiarity with railhead operations, loading and offloading ships, all of those things. So I would say it's a mixed challenge, both of opportunity and issues.
Thank you. So, Conrad, if you answer this question perfectly, it negates the question, but in what domain, or with respect to ground forces, what capability area do you think technical surprise is most likely in the future?
Wow. If I give you an answer, then I guarantee to be wrong. I mean, it's when this is like one of those questions you used to get at West Point, and when HR and I were teaching mill history, and you get to the last lesson, and you'd say, okay, you'd set up a board, and you'd say, where's the next war going to be? And I'd have one board covered with the answer on it, and the cadets would give me their list of where they thought the next war was going to be, and I'd go over the approved solution. They'd say the approved solution is, and I'd put the screen up, and it'd say somewhere else. So it's always, again, it's. I guess my biggest concern right now is I think we are, and I'll throw a stab at it. I think we are. I'm a cyber skeptic. I spent 6 months working with Keith Alexander to try to develop an FM 324 style manual for cybercom. The effort failed for a number of reasons, but I really went through that realizing that there's certain realities out there that the more capabilities you have, the more vulnerabilities you have. There's no economy of force in cyberspace. There's unlimited amount of electrons people can throw at us. You are going to get penetrated. You are going to lose capabilities. And the answer to that is, I think we are going to get surprised in the cyber realm, and the answer is, how do we respond to that? We've got to be redundant and resilient. You know, if there's a word for it in technology today, I think it's got to be resiliency. We are going to get surprised. We've got to be able to bounce back. And I'm concerned that in the quest for efficiency, that we're going to lose a lot of the effectiveness that comes out of having redundant systems in our capabilities. So I guess that'd be the stab I'd throw at it.
Dave, I want to riff off of a comment that Con made during his presentation. That's anticipation. I have no doubt that we will be surprised, but quite often we are surprised by what is right in front of our face. And the issue of Russia is a perfect example. Russia's been on a path to where they are today for more than a decade. And the intel community, in this case, was shouting loudly, and policymakers, services, et cetera, were not listening. And so our challenges are often, as the 9/11 Commission noted, a lack of imagination or anticipating a problem. I would add one other that we are ignoring, and I mentioned it during my presentation, and that is tactical nuclear weapons. That is regaining its place on the battlefield.
Thank you. So Nadia, the next question is for you. How do you, based on your experience working with think tanks and other areas in Washington, how do you view the prospect for the policy community recognizing the role of Army forces in wide area control as a legitimate reason for force structure?
So essentially, I mean, I think that panels like this and the discussions that are going on, I think the Army actually has been more successful over the past few years in advancing the idea that you can't accomplish your political aims without ground forces. I don't think necessarily that the Army message has been unclear, but I think that there's been an unwillingness to accept the implications of the message. I think that over time that could change, but I actually think it's not so much that the Army lacks clarity in its arguments. I can point to many, many clear statements about the importance of adequate capacity with the backup, the data that you need to make that argument. And I can point to equally as many statements on the political side where many in the think tanks and the broader policy community simply don't agree with the assumptions or don't want to listen to the statements. So I am, unfortunately, in a way, as events play out in the world, it will continue to prove, I think, many of the points that we're trying to make on this panel. I don't think you're going to see changes in a lot of the regions of the world where you see conflict unfolding and continuing without changes over control of territory. I mean, in the end, we're either going to have the frozen conflicts of eastern Ukraine remaining, and I think if I had to predict, it will remain there for quite some time. But eventually, I think, we're going to see that air power alone, technology alone, is not going to be enough to change the political dynamics on the ground there. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to deploy military forces everywhere to resolve those conflicts, but we do need to be engaged much more deeply at the political level than we currently are, and that's the other part of the problem. On the surprise, I just wanted to add one of my little obsessions in terms of Khan's question. I would say the electric grid, actually. I think there are a couple of areas that are not squarely in the military domain that will be considered potentially acts of war or be seriously disruptive to the United States. And the challenge will be that they are not all in the dot mil domain, but they will have significant repercussions. And it's not necessarily a surprise because everyone who follows the issue knows the extraordinary weaknesses in the grid, both physical infrastructure and cyber. So we can't say we're going to be surprised, but it's a question of when our adversaries are going to decide to act on that.
Thank you. So, John, you mentioned the Internet of Things We have a question here. What are some Internet of Thing ideas that the Army is considering, or alternately, what are some of the problems that technology might be able to help solve?
That's a good question, and let me just start off. And when you talk about the network, and I said about protecting the network and convergence on what is on the network, and Conrad talked about resiliency and redundancy, and all those have to happen. But in the future, if you're in this global mesh network, and you had adversaries with near-peer competitors, and who owns the network first of all, and what capabilities can you do? What levels can you impose options on an adversary? How low can we do that at the battalion level? Can it happen at the brigade level? Do we have defensive capabilities? Do we have offensive capabilities? So way down the road into 2040, when you're talking about hardware-software convergence, you're looking at this global mesh network and everyone plugging in. So much like you may have in your home, where you turn on your Wi-Fi and you may have 4 to 5 to 6 devices, your TV is all internet. Imagine the future battle space with everyone's plugged in a wireless mesh network, and the ability on all your platforms to plug into a network, and no longer a difference between a hardware and a software. It's all convergent. And the network is not just a cyber network. It's got EW, it's got human SIGINT, it's got all our other capabilities on that network. So when you look at the battlefield, the military intranet of things, it's how do all our systems plug in? How are they preserved, protected, redundant in this global mesh network, where near-peer competitors operate on the mesh also and can do things to us, and we can defend or do offensive capabilities. So think of it in terms of that, with the military systems, platforms, communication systems on a network that you plug into in the future, down the road in the 2040 time period.
Okay, so the next question I'll direct to General Hicks, but I think any other panel members might want to kick in on it. How does Army Future Vertical Lift fit into the Army's capability and capacity strategies?
So, as John noted, the introduction of Army aviation really changed the dynamics of the battlefield. And so Future Vertical Lift excuse me, allows the Army to redefine the battlefield geometry in ways that we are increasingly challenged to do today, because the base platforms we're using, of course, were designed in the 1960s, manufactured in the 70s, and they've been upgraded over time. So this next step in Future Vertical Lift is going to not just restore our ability to define the battlefield geometry today, but to actually define it for, I think, the coming decades. And one of the things that we have, I think, become less, again, I talked about being creative or thinking, not having a lack of imagination. If you think about what we were talking before we walked in about Viscount Slim, and he moved entire divisions using C-46 and C-47 aircraft in the China-Burma theater to meet Japanese operations, and frankly redefined the battlefield, and in many cases dislocated his adversary by showing up in places that they did not anticipate him to be. And that's what Future Vertical Lift brings to the Army.
And I'd like to add one thing there that hits on 3 key points when you talk about capability and capacity, and I'll do that very quickly, is, you talk about the CH-47. We really had, and I talked earlier about repurposing, about innovating and using using existing equipment. The S&T on CH-47 was in the 50s, somewhere around there. We introduced in the 60s, and the retirement for the CH-47 is about 2048. And if you went to the Army Modernization Center, it's got a question mark, because it may not retire then. But we've upgraded the avionics, we've upgraded lethality platforms, the cockpit systems, multiple other kinds of devices on there that kept that system in place. So the innovation, the repurposing of existing equipment, 100 years of a CH-47 that is there as we move to the next platform. Thank you.
I just quickly want to mention Future Vertical Lift is critical to the capability of expeditionary maneuver. Because our enemies have sophisticated anti-access area denial capabilities, we know we cannot deploy forces on top of those enemies. We have to be able to go to offset objectives. So Future Vertical Lift, from a lift perspective, will allow us to deploy rapidly into unexpected locations with forces that can then transition into offensive operations. The reconnaissance variant of Future Vertical Lift we think is very important as well in connection with our expeditionary maneuver capabilities to be able to deploy those aircraft, self-deploy, or to deploy them in Air Force aircraft over strategic distances. The capabilities that come with Future Vertical Lift with increased speed gives you the ability to get more forces in as well. And why do you need manned aircraft in the future? Well, I think if you're going to put soldiers in the back of an aircraft, you're going to want a pilot in it. The other reason is we need manned and unmanned teaming. And what we need to be able to do in the future is fight in 3 dimensions. The recon variant, in particular, Future Vertical Lift, will help us pose multiple dilemmas to the enemy. Fight in 3 dimensions. Fight in mutual support of one another, air and ground. What is important in combat is not going to be just to target the enemy, obviously, in maneuver. You want to know where the enemy is, but where the enemy is not. And you need an aircraft that can operate with that small footprint, very maneuverable, that can then pull maneuver forces into positions of relative advantage. FVL, I think, we ought to make it a goal. How do we get it faster? I mean, can we be more agile? Can we drive costs down? Can we deliver it in a way that's different from the normal acquisition system and get those capabilities into the force earlier than the planned time horizon? But I think FVL is a critical capability for our Army in the future.
Here's another question for the panel as a whole. Please discuss the impact of time and generating capacity, manning, training, equipping.
Yeah.
So I'll take the first shot. Over the last decade, we went through the Grow the Army effort to expand the force to support principally the surge into Iraq. And what we know is generating a force from scratch takes about, and to maintain a reasonable degree of quality, takes about between 2 and 3 years to constitute a capable brigade combat team. We also know from our historic experience in World War II, and we constantly get this refrain when we're discussing this in the Pentagon, where you were able to radically grow the Army from 1940 forward, when you went up to about 450, and of course we had millions of people in the Army in 42 and 43. True, but if you look at the tactical performance of those organizations, it was questionable in many cases. You can't take away from their heroics, but Truscott writes about his forces in Morocco breaking on the beach with U.S. naval gunfire going over their heads because they had never been exposed to anything that remotely prepared them for that. So that's a constant debate back and forth. What we are doing right now, and the National Commission recommended this as well, but some of this is underway ahead of time. We've been looking at both expansion and regeneration as requirements for the last several years. And one of the concepts that Joe Milley has talked about is taking or constituting a advise and assist brigade, which is effectively a cadre for a new unit. And this builds off of a couple of points. One, we expect that we will not walk away from continue to advise and assist other nations around the world, particularly those in combat. Two, it works off of the fact that we will have to expand the Army rapidly in time of crisis. We always have. And three, it builds off of our experience with cohort units in the 1980s in particular. And so you have a cadre of officers effectively, and NCOs effectively, a brigade chain of command that can rapidly absorb troops trained in a cohort fashion to add to the combat power of the Army. And we're going to be running pilots on that this year and next year as we go forward, and I think that will help us begin to get after this problem.
Dr. Crane.
Just there's really one of my pet rocks lately has been this myth of expansibility. I mean, we have never really expanded the Army rapidly. We've thought we have, but even the World War II experience, it takes years and it's nasty. And we also have a thing called the draft. We also have a massive industrial base that we can remobilize. So Westinghouse goes from building refrigerators to building tanks. I mean, we can do things like that. I don't think we get Samsung and LG to build American tanks. So we don't have the draft. We don't have the massive industrial base. It always takes time. My newest concern about the expansibility problems is what happens if we actually get in a war where we have to take some casualties? How do we, we lose a couple of armored brigades, we lose some BCTs, we lose a couple dozen F-22s. Are we really equipped to, how fast can we, regeneration becomes another issue. I mean, there's a lot of, and I know General Hicks has been involved in a lot of this, there's a lot of myths out there, a lot of bad assumptions about how fast we can reconstitute and regenerate that are just way off the mark, I think.
I'll just make a quick comment on this as well. And you have to understand really categories within the Army, do basic Army math, right? So across the total force, you have the institutional Army, you have committed forces that are committed to vital missions overseas, and then you have a surge capability. That surge capability is at a historic low. And so if there is a crisis, you're going to have to generate more forces. Part of the problem with the time it takes is the time to realize you're in a crisis, right? I mean, it took us, I mean, the train wreck in Army readiness happened in 2003 when we knew we had a sustained commitment in Iraq. But it took until, what, 2007, was it? 6, 7, to really recognize that train wreck was happening, had happened years ago, and then to grow the Army. Then it took, as Bill said, 32 months to grow brigade combat teams. So it's the time to do it, but it's also the time to realize it. And so it is more efficient in many ways to maintain the deterrent capability and the capacity than to rebuild it later. An example is Europe. Bill mentioned, harbingers of Russian behavior. I mean, pretty obvious, invasion of Georgia, 2008. But we stayed on the path to reduce forces in Europe. What do we need in Europe today? Pretty much what we had in Europe 5 years ago. But look how hard it is to get back into Europe what we took out, even though that was well after what we should have maybe recognized as a change in pattern in 2008.
Well, on the topic of time, we are out of time, and I'd like to conclude the panel and invite the audience to thank them for their contributions.
Hey, this is a world-class panel right here, by the way. That's worth about 3 weeks'